The morning after the storm, 3 families on Harlan Ridge had no roofs. 2 more had walls that had shifted so far from their foundations that the doors would not close again until spring, if they closed at all. A barn on the Kowalski place had simply folded, the way wet paper folds, and taken 4 months to store hay with it. But at the far end of the ridge, set back against a hillside where no one had ever thought to build, a small mound of frozen earth sat quiet in the gray light. No broken timbers, no collapsed ridge beam, no family standing in the snow, looking at what used to be their home. From a road, it barely looked like a house. It looked like the hill had grown a door. The woman who built it had been called foolish for doing so. She had been called worse. Her neighbors had used words like dangerous and irresponsible, words that men tend to reach for when a woman makes a decision they cannot immediately explain. That morning, as the wind finally dropped and the temperature climbed back above zero, several of those same men walked down the road toward that mound of earth. They carried nothing. They had nothing left to carry. What she did with that moment says more about the winter of 1886 than any weather record ever could. If you're watching from somewhere cold tonight, tell us where you are. Stories like this survive because people still care enough to remember them. And if this kind of frontier wisdom matters to you, subscribing helps keep it alive. Her name was Marta Voss, and she was 34 years old when she bought the piece of land that nobody else wanted. It was the autumn of 1884. Her husband, a Norwegian-born carpenter named Elias, had died of a lung sickness the previous February, leaving her with 2 children, a mule, $41, and a piece of paper that said she owned nothing. The house they had been renting on the edge of Caldwell County belonged to a man named Garrett, and Garrett had been patient exactly as long as Elias was alive. She had 3 weeks to find somewhere else to go. The parcel on Harlan Ridge had been sitting unsold for 2 years. The county agent described it as marginal, which was a word that meant steep, rocky, poorly drained, and too far from the road to be worth the trouble. There was a creek that flooded in spring. There was a north-facing slope that stayed frozen into late April. The soil, ran thin over a shelf of gray limestone. The price reflected all of this. Marta paid $37 and kept 4 for the winter. Her neighbor to the south was a man named Aldous Crane, who ran cattle on the lower pastures and had been watching the Harlan Ridge parcel with mild interest. He had not bought it because he had no real use for it, but he had not expected a widow to buy it either, and somehow that bothered him more than the price. He rode up to introduce himself the afternoon. She arrived with her children and her mule, and a wagon that was carrying more rope than furniture. He looked at the parcel. He looked at her. He said, politely enough, that he hoped she understood what she had purchased. She said she did. He said the winters up on the ridge were something different from the winters down in the valley. He said the wind came off the open plain to the northwest and had nothing to stop it for 40 miles before it hit that hillside. He said the family that had tried to build on that parcel 10 years earlier had lasted 1 season. Marta listened to all of this without interrupting. Then she asked if he was finished. He said he supposed he was. She thanked him for his time and began unloading the wagon. Crane rode back down the road, and that evening at the feed store he told 2 men that the widow Voss had bought herself a piece of bad luck and was too proud to know it yet. The men nodded. Word traveled the way it always did. By the end of the week, most of Harlan Ridge knew that the Norwegian widow had made a mistake she could not afford to make. What none of them knew was that Marta Voss had spent the last 3 weeks doing something none of them had done. She had walked that parcel every morning alone in the cold, and she had been watching. She was not a builder by training. Elias had been the one who understood timber and joints and the way a roof transfers its weight to the walls beneath it. But Marta had watched him work for 9 years, and she had the kind of attention that does not announce itself. She had also grown up in a valley in Norway, in a house that her grandfather had built into the side of a hill. She had not thought much about that house in 20 years. She thought about it now. For the first 2 weeks on the Harlan Ridge parcel, she did not touch the land. She walked it. She watched where the morning frost melted first, and where it held until noon. She watched where the wind came from and where it slowed. She found the places where the limestone shelf ran close to the surface, and the places where the earth was deep and held together when she pressed it. She watched what the mule did. The animal was old and particular about cold. On the first morning, Marta turned it loose and let it wander. By mid-afternoon, it had settled itself against the south-facing lower slope of the hill, where the rock absorbed whatever sun the October sky offered and gave it back slowly through the afternoon. The mule stood there with its eyes half closed and did not move until dark. Marta noted this. She also noted that the wind, which came hard from the northwest most evenings, broke against the upper ridge and curled away from a shallow depression about 40 yards from the base of the hill. If you stood in that depression, you could hear the wind above you, but you could not feel it. She stood there for a long time. The plan she arrived at was not complicated, but it looked strange to anyone who had only ever built in straight lines on flat ground. She would not build a cabin and then try to fend it against the wind. She would build into hill itself, using the earth as her primary wall on 3 sides, and only face one wall to the outside. That wall would face south, where the winter sun was low and could reach her windows, and it would be sheltered from the northwest by the curve of the hill behind her. She drew this in the dirt with a stick, then drew it again on paper with a pencil her daughter held steady for her. Her son, who was 11, looked at the drawing for a long time. He asked if they were going to live in a hole. She said they were going to live in a house. Then she said that holes did not have windows, and she intended to have 2. She did not explain further. She did not feel she owed anyone an explanation, including her son. But that evening, after the children were asleep, she sat by the small fire and held the paper drawing against her knees and looked at it until the fire burned down to nothing. She had $4. She had a mule and an axe and a supply of rope. She had limestone beneath her feet and clay in the hillside and timber in the draw below the creek. She had seen one winter take everything a family owned in a single night. She did not intend to let that happen again. She broke ground on the 3rd week of October. Her son, whose name was Henrik, worked beside her every day after his morning lessons. Her daughter, Sigrid, who was 8, carried water and held things steady and kept account of the stones they pulled from the hillside, which she recorded in a small notebook with a stub of pencil that she refused to let anyone else use. The method was slow. Marta cut back into the hillside at a slight upward angle, following the natural shelf of limestone that would become her floor. She packed the cut walls firm with clay dug from a wet seam lower on the slope, and she laid stones at the base of each wall to carry the weight of the earth above them. The roof timbers she cut from straight-grained ash in the draw below the creek, and she laid them close together, then covered them with brush, then clay, then a thick layer of sod cut in squares and placed grass side down. The whole structure, when it was finished, would be invisible from the road except for the south wall and the door. Aldous Crane came by in early November on his way back from town. He stopped his horse and looked at what she was building for a long moment without speaking. Then he rode down the slope to where she was working. He said he'd seen dugouts before, and what she was building was not quite a dugout. He said he respected the effort, but that a roof of that kind, carrying that much earth weight, needed more support than she appeared to be giving it. He pointed to the roof timbers and said they were too widely spaced. Marta listened to him carefully. She said she had spaced them 16 inches apart. He said that was still too wide for that much earth above. She thought about it for 3 days. Then she went back into draw and cut more ash and added a timber between each existing pair, bringing the spacing to 8 inches. The work cost her a week. But when she was done, she pressed down on the roof from above with her full weight, and she felt nothing give. She did not tell Crane she had made the change, but she noted something important in the making of it. He had been right about the spacing, which meant that his doubt in that case had been more useful to her than agreement would have been. She began to consider what else she might be wrong about. She added a second layer of clay to the north wall, packing it thicker than she had originally planned. She cut drainage channels along the base of the hill above the structure, so that snowmelt would run to the sides and not down through the roof. She left a small gap at the peak of the south wall, just below the roof line, for ventilation, and covered it with a piece of oilcloth that could be opened or closed depending on conditions. By mid-November, the structure was sealed. The first night they slept inside it, the temperature outside dropped to 14 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside, with a small fire burning in the stone stove she built against the back wall, it reached 51 degrees. She recorded this in Sigrid's notebook. She did not celebrate. She wrote the number down and went to sleep. The real test had not come yet. She knew that. Anyone who had spent a winter on Harlan Ridge knew that what came in November was only the opening argument. The rain came in late November, and it came hard. 3 days of it, driven sideways by the northwest wind, soaking into the sod roof and running in dark lines down the clay of the south wall. On the second night, Marta heard something she had not expected, a low, soft sound like a settling. She took the lantern and went outside in the rain and walked around the structure, holding the light close to the walls. On the northeast corner, where the hillside met the cut wall, a vertical crack had opened in the clay. It was narrow enough to slide a finger into and ran from somewhere near the roof line down to the ground. She stood in the rain and looked at it for a long time. Inside, Henrik had come to the doorway and was watching her. She told him to go back to sleep. She stayed outside until she understood what she was seeing. The crack was not in the structural clay. It was in the surface coat, the final layer she had applied for weatherproofing. Beneath it, the packed earth and stone base appeared solid. The crack was letting water in, but it was not a failure of the structure. It was a failure of the skin. The next morning, Crane rode by again, and this time he was not alone. A man named Peterson, who owned the largest farm on the lower ridge, came with him. They both looked at the corner where the crack had appeared. Peterson said nothing, but the way he looked at it said enough. Crane said that clay without fiber tended to crack under water pressure. He said that was a known problem with earthen walls, and that was why most builders in the county used timber. Marta said she appreciated the information. After they left, she spent the rest of the day mixing a new surface coat. She added dry prairie grass cut fine to the clay and pressed the mixture deep into the crack, and then smoothed it in layers over the entire corner section. She had read about this in a book that Elias had owned, a book on construction methods that she had carried in the bottom of her wagon and had not mentioned to anyone. The method was old, older than the county, older than the territory. The Romans had used something similar. The Puebloans of the Southwest had used something similar. The technique had been discovered independently by people who lived close to the ground and paid attention to what the ground was telling them. The reinforced wall did not crack again, but the story of the corner crack had already traveled. By the first week of December, the consensus on Harlan Ridge was that the widow Voss had built something that was already failing, and that she would not make it to February. She heard this. Neighbors did not bother to lower their voices when they thought a woman was not listening. She recorded the outside temperature that night. It was 4 degrees below zero. The inside temperature, with the stove burning low, was 47 degrees. She wrote both numbers in the notebook. Then she wrote a third number on a separate page at the back, where she kept a running count of the nights that had passed since they moved in. It was night 31. 31 nights, and they were still warm. December moved slowly and with purpose. The temperature on Harlan Ridge dropped in stages, each stage a little harder than the last. The way cold always tests a structure, starting with the weak points and working toward the center. By the third week, the overnight lows were reaching 15 and 18 degrees below zero, and the creek at the bottom of the draw had stopped moving. In the frame houses along the lower road, families were burning through their supply faster than they had planned. Peterson had already sent a boy to town for an extra cord. Crane was burning green wood, which smoked badly and gave less heat than it promised. 2 families on the north side of the ridge were keeping their children in one room and closing off the rest of the house. Marta's fire burned 4 hours a night. She had calculated this during construction, or tried to. The earth on 3 sides of the structure did not heat up quickly, but it did not cool quickly either. The limestone floor held what warmth the stove gave it and released it slowly through night, the way a flat stone left near a fire stays warm long after the fire is gone. The clay walls above the stone did the same. She was not creating extra heat. She was losing less of it. This was a distinction that her neighbors had not understood, because no one had explained it to them and they had not thought to ask. One evening in late December, Sigrid came to Marta while she was banking the fire and asked why the cabin was different from the Pedersens' house. Marta thought for a moment. She said the Pedersens' house was trying to stay warm. Their house was trying not to go cold. She said there was a difference, and the difference showed up in the woodpile. Sigrid wrote this in the notebook, word for word. Henrik, who was more skeptical by nature, asked what would happen if the big storm came. Everyone on the ridge talked about the big storm, the one that came every 10 or 15 years, and lasted longer than any house was built to handle. Marta said they would find out. She said it with a calm that was not performance. She had done what she could do. She had watched and corrected and watched again. She had sealed the crack, deepened the roof drainage channels, added a second wooden shutter to the inside of the south window. She had stacked 6 weeks of firewood against the east-facing exterior wall, under a lean-to of sod and ash timber that kept it dry. She had also done something that none of her neighbors knew about. On an afternoon in late November, she had walked the hill above her cabin and dug 3 test holes at different depths, measuring how far down the ground temperature stayed constant, unaffected by the surface cold. She had found it at about 4 feet. At 4 feet, even in the worst of the winter, the earth itself held a temperature somewhere above freezing. Her floor sat 2 feet below the original surface level. Her walls extended another 6 feet into the hill. She had built herself into the one layer of earth that winter could not fully reach. She did not know the word for this principle. She did not need to. She had found it the same way her grandfather had found it, by looking at what the ground was doing and asking why. New Year's came without ceremony. Henrik turned 12. Sigrid gave him a notebook to hold for one day as a present, then asked for it back before supper. The woodpile was barely touched. Outside, the sky to the northwest had been doing something for 3 days that Marta recognized. She had seen that color once before, as a child in Norway. The day before a storm that her grandmother had described for the rest of her life. She said nothing about this to the children, but she brought the mule inside. It arrived on the 9th of January. Later, people would give a name, the kind of name that counties give to storms that rewrite the records. But on the morning it arrived, it had no name yet. It was just weather, moving in from the northwest faster than any weather had moved in years, pushing a wall of cold air that dropped the temperature 20 degrees in 40 minutes. The wind was the first thing. Not the cold, not the snow, but the wind, arriving before everything else, as if to announce what was coming and give no one time to prepare. It hit the ridge around mid-morning and bent a few remaining trees on the exposed slope sideways, hard enough that Crane's youngest son, who had been walking to the woodshed, had to crawl on his hands and knees to get back to the door. The snow came 2 hours later. By midday, the road was gone. By mid-afternoon, the fence lines were gone. The snow was not falling so much as it was moving horizontally, driven by a wind that had not paused or gentled in 6 hours, and the temperature was still dropping. Inside the frame houses on the lower road, families were doing the same calculation. How much wood, how long, how cold? Crane's house was well built, but its north wall faced the open wind with nothing between it and the plain, and he could feel the cold moving to the timber like water through cloth. He kept the family in the kitchen, which had the stove, and closed every other door. He burned half a core between noon and dark. Peterson's house lost a section of roof at 3 in the afternoon, not the whole roof. A section, where a rafter joint had been weaker than anyone knew, and the wind found the way wind always does, testing every seam until it finds the one that gives. His wife and daughters moved mattresses against the inside wall and waited. On the north slope, a family named Gudmundson gave up entirely before dark. They had built their house in the first year, quick and cheap, because quick and cheap was what they had. They loaded what they could on a horse-drawn sled and made for Crane's place, fighting the wind every yard. At the far end of the ridge, in the shallow depression against the hillside, Marta's cabin sat under 2 feet of drifted snow with a thin thread of smoke rising from the stovepipe. Inside, it was 44 degrees. She had let the fire burn lower than usual because she intended to sleep and could not tend it through the night. This was the calculation she had made and remade all autumn. The structure would hold what heat she gave it. She did not need to give it much. She fed the stove carefully, banked the coals, and checked the ventilation cloth at the top of the south wall. The wind was pressing against it, not breaking through, which meant the drainage channels were holding the weight of the drifting snow off the roof. She checked the timbers. She pressed her palm flat against the north wall, the one buried deepest in the hill. It was not warm, but it was warmer than the air, warmer than the floor, warmer than any outside wall had any right to be in a storm like this one. Sigurd was asleep. Henrik was awake, sitting up in his bunk with a notebook pressed against his chest, not writing anything, just holding it. He asked if the roof would hold. Marta looked at the timbers above them, each one 8 inches from the next, each one cut from straight-grained ash and sealed with clay and carrying 2 feet of frozen earth above it. She said she thought it would. He asked what would happen if it didn't. She said they would deal with that if it came. Then she told him to sleep because she needed him useful in the morning. He was quiet for a while. Then he said that the wind sounded like it was angry. She said it was not angry. It was just wind. It did not know they were there. It did not know anything about them. It was only doing what wind did, which was to find the weak places and go through them. She paused. She said the important thing was not to have weak places. She did not sleep much that night. She rose twice to check the stovepipe, and once to check the drainage at the east side where the snow was deepest against the wall. Each time she went out through the south door and moved to the dark and the howling cold. She came back and stood inside the door for a moment, feeling the difference between outside and in. The difference was significant. By 3 in the morning, the outside temperature had dropped to 31 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The storm was not weakening. If anything, the wind had shifted slightly to the north, which was the worst direction for the lower road houses, but slightly better for the depression where Marta had built. She went back to her bunk. She lay on her back in the dark and listened to the storm and the timbers and the slow breath of her children, and she waited for morning the way you wait for something you have done everything you can prepare for, and must now simply trust. The wind stopped before dawn, not gradually, but all at once, the way a blizzard sometimes ends, as if a door had been closed somewhere out on the plain. The silence that followed was so complete that Marta heard Sigurd's breath change, the child waking up into the absence of sound. Marta was already dressed. She had been awake since the wind stopped. She opened the south door and pushed against the drift that had formed overnight. It gave after the second push, and she stepped out into a world that was white and still and almost entirely rearranged from what it had been the day before. She walked the structure first, before she did anything else. The roof was carrying perhaps 3 feet of snow in the center, and more at the edges where it had drifted. She tested the surface with her hand, and found it solid and compressed. She checked the drainage channels, which had directed the meltwater to either side exactly as she had intended. She checked the east wall, the firewood lean-to, the ventilation cloth. Everything was as she had left it. She stood at the south end and looked down the ridge toward the road. She could see Crane's house from here. The roof was intact, but the north-facing porch had collapsed under the snow weight. She could see a figure moving near the woodshed. She could see that the Peterson place had a corner of the roof missing, visible even from this distance as a dark gap against the white sky. She could not see the Gudmundson house at all. It was on the back side of the north slope. She would find out about that later. She went inside and stoked the fire and made breakfast of what they had, which was cornmeal and dried salt pork and a tin of molasses that Sigrid guarded like currency. The cabin was 41 degrees when she woke the children, which was the coldest it had been since they moved in. By 9 in the morning, it was 48. By 10, she heard footsteps in the snow outside. She looked through the south window and saw 3 men coming up the slope from a road. Crane was in front. Peterson was behind him, his coat wrapped tight, his hat pressed down against the cold. The third man she recognized as a neighbor from further along the ridge, a man named Hoff, who had always been cordial to her, but had never had much to say. She opened the door before they knocked. They stood in the entrance, all 3 of them, and looked at the interior of the cabin. They looked at the children eating their breakfast. They looked at the stove, which was burning low and steady. They looked at the clay walls and the stone floor and the timber roof above them, weighted with snow and holding perfectly. Crane looked the longest. He was a man who had farmed this ridge for 16 years and who had seen storms before, though perhaps not this one, not quite this bad. He looked at the structure that this woman had built into a hill that everyone, including himself, had told her was worthless, and he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said that his north porch had gone in the night. He said the Gudmundson family had come to his house before dark and were still there. He said Peterson needed help covering the open section of his roof before the next cold set in. Marta said she would come down when the children had finished eating. No one mentioned the things that had been said in October. No one mentioned the word foolish, which had been used more than once. They did not look at her with gratitude exactly, or with apology exactly. They looked at her the way you look at someone who has just demonstrated something you wish you had known sooner. Hoff, who had been quiet the whole time, looked at Henrik. He asked the boy how warm it had stayed through the night. Henrik looked at Marta. She nodded. He went and got the notebook and read the numbers out loud. The temperature at midnight. The temperature at 3 in the morning. The temperature when they woke. Hoff listened to all of them without saying anything. Then he asked Henrik if he could look at the notebook. Henrik handed it over. Hoff stood in the doorway of the earth cabin and turned through the pages carefully, looking at the columns of dates and temperatures that Sigrid had kept in her careful penciled hand since November. 62 nights of numbers that showed, more plainly than any argument could, what the difference between the structure and the ones on the road below had been worth. Hoff closed the notebook and handed it back. He said to Marta that he had a south-facing slope on his property. He said he had always thought it was useless for building. He asked if she would be willing to walk it with him in the spring and tell him what she saw. She said she would. She put on her coat and her boots and followed the 3 men down the slope toward the road, toward the work that needed doing, leaving Sigrid to bank the fire and Henrik to write the morning's temperature in the notebook. He wrote it at the top of a new page. January 10th. Clear. 34 degrees outside. 48 inside. He started to close the notebook, then opened it again and wrote one more line below the numbers. Roof held. By the following autumn, Hoff had begun excavating into his south-facing slope. He did not copy Marta's design exactly. He made it larger, added a second room, used more limestone on the floor because his section of hillside had more of it to spare. He asked questions as he built, and Marta answered them plainly, the way she answered all questions, with what she knew and nothing beyond it. Two other families on the ridge began asking similar questions. One of them started building in October. The other waited until the following spring, which was a reasonable choice on that particular parcel, given where the drainage ran. Marta did not become famous for this. The county records from those years mention no particular innovation on Harlan Ridge. The storm of January 1886 is noted in a line or two, the dates and the low temperatures, and that several structures sustained damage. No record names a cabin at the end of the ridge. The one that sustained none. The notebook survived. Sigrid kept it for the rest of her life. And after Sigrid, her daughter kept it, and it passed through the family in that way that important objects sometimes do, not because anyone made a formal decision to preserve it, but because no one could bring themselves to throw it away. What the notebook recorded, night by night through that winter, was not genius. It was not a discovery in the scientific sense. It was something quieter than that. It was the result of a woman with $4 and a mule and 2 children walking a piece of land that everyone called worthless and asking, for 3 weeks, what the land itself was trying to say. The earth on Harlan Ridge had been doing the same things for 10,000 years, holding warmth in its stones, releasing it slowly, sheltering the low places from the wind that came hard from the northwest, offering, to anyone who was patient enough to look, a way to live that was not about fighting the cold, but about understanding where it could not reach. Marta Voss understood this because she needed to, because she had $4 and a mule and no other option, and because she had grown up in a valley in Norway where her grandfather had already learned the same thing, and the knowledge had lived in her somewhere without her realizing it until the land on Harlan Ridge asked her the right question. That kind of knowledge does not make the news. It does not win awards. It does not usually survive. But sometimes, in the right conditions, it finds a notebook and a daughter who refuses to throw it away. The cabin stood on that hillside for 31 years, until Marta's children were grown and gone, and she herself had moved to live with Henrik's family in the valley. By then the sod roof had been replaced twice. The ventilation cloth had long since been traded for a proper wooden vent, and the south wall had been extended to add a small room for a wood stove that burned even less than the original. When the structure was finally abandoned, the hills simply took it back, the way hills do, patiently and without ceremony. The depression in the slope is still there if you know where to look. The earth beneath it has been holding its temperature for a very long time. It does not need anyone to remember it to keep doing so. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes. It is not engineering, construction, or safety advice.